Let's make a start then. So welcome everyone to this session, which is entitled, and I'm going to have to take a deep breath, Resilient Social Services Systems and Supply Chains Matter. What does the pandemic mean for government procurement? So the first part of the session is going to be a panel discussion with multiple panelists addressing various aspects of that question. And there will be time for Q&A at the end of that session, hopefully. And in part two, we're going to move on to look at co-designing the work of the POGO network, Procurement of Government Outcomes network, for the next 12 months. It's been my privilege to chair that over the past year. And this is a really exciting opportunity to review where we've got to and to think about how we're going to move forward in the way that is most constructive and helpful for everyone involved. And there'll be an opportunity to discuss that in breakout groups and contribute to the future of the network. So I think those are the main introductory things that I wanted to say. Just by way of a reminder, these sessions are being recorded. I think you're going to have panelist introductions on the slides in front of you, which will allow us a bit more time for the discussion and save me having to do elaborate introductions. So apologies to everyone, I'm not going to do elaborate introductions. I'm not being rude. I'm just trying to keep us all on track. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first panelist, Abby Semple.
Okay, great. Thank you, Anne. And we've all been threatened with technological castration by way of muting if we go over our time. So I'm going to try and set a good example and stick to my 5 minutes, but please do castrate me if I don't. We're looking today at, what does the pandemic mean? And what I wanted to draw attention to was maybe sort of 3 quite brief lessons that we might be able to learn. And the first is obviously learning from the mistakes, the many mistakes that were made in terms of procurement during the pandemic. And it's not really hard to find examples. So in the UK, the most prominent is probably a number of contracts linked to PPE, and various problems and really quite dodgy things going on in terms of protective equipment, how that was procured. Now, you could say, okay, it's great to stand back and sort of criticize, but it's very difficult to get things right in the heat of the moment. But even with that in mind, I think we have to say there's some really, really terrible things that happened and that had very real consequences in terms of people's lives and working environment. You could say, well, what has that got to do with social outcomes? These are very different types of contracts. These are supply contracts. The supply chains are different. The considerations are different. But for one thing, the legal framework in which they're awarded is the same as most social outcomes contracts. In many cases, the procedures are actually the same. And in many cases, the objectives include social objectives at some point in the delivery of the contract. If we're trying to save lives or improve people's health, then that is a social objective. And sometimes some of the supply chain challenges are similar as well in terms of visibility of your supply chain. So I think the first thing is to learn from those mistakes where we can. There are many other examples as well in terms of things like test and trace and the school meal vouchers. So I think sort of trying to take a slightly dispassionate view of those and see what we can learn from that is extremely important. Then the next step, I suppose, is to learn from the successes, because there have been some successes in terms of what government was able to do during the pandemic in various jurisdictions. So I think sticking with the UK for the moment, the ventilator challenge was at least partially successful. And it was really interesting in terms of what it threw up in terms of, the number of companies stepping forward from various fields to try and, produce ventilators. Not all of them were successful. Not all of them ended up being needed in the end. But we did get some quite innovative and novel approaches to bringing together different partners along the supply chain. And again, I think you can say there is some transferability to the broader field of public services. In terms of bringing perhaps unconventional partners together to work towards a specific challenge. And the way it was structured, I thought was quite good as well in terms of its dynamism. And then looking more towards the EU level, some of the aspects of the joint procurement of protective equipment were actually quite successful. Some of them didn't work as well, but again, acting under a lot of time pressure, I think there were some very good examples of collaboration between different European partners to activate the supply chain around PPE. And it remains to be seen how well that's going to work in terms of vaccine procurement as well. So lots to draw upon there, and I do think there's transferability between sort of so-called conventional fields of procurement and more social outcomes types of contracts. And then finally, there's this idea of building back better and what we mean by that. So, how do we actually build social outcomes into every single contract? There's going to be a huge amount of public spending coming on tap. So, at EU level, there's a 750 billion euro recovery fund. All that money, or most of it, has to go through procurement in one way or another. So are there sort of 2 or 3 key transferable practices from this whole field of research into social outcomes contracts that we can try and package to make more relevant towards these very large sums of money that are going to have to be spent? Everyone seems willing to sign up to the idea of building back better, but we obviously need to tease out what that means. Is it social outcomes as well as environmental outcomes? How do we define them? How do we build those partnerships, and how do we measure them? So I do think there's a lot of transferability there, and perhaps this group can sort of try and stretch the boundaries a little bit in terms of how you relate conventional procurement to more social outcomes types of contracts. I think my time is up.
Fantastic, thank you. That is some impressive timekeeping and sets a great example for colleagues. Aris, you're up next.
Can you hear me? Good afternoon, good morning, depending where you log on. My name is Aris Georgopoulos. I'm from the School of Law from the University of Nottingham and the Public Procurement Research Group. For those who don't know me, also I'm a procurement consultant and an attorney registered at the Greek Supreme Court. Following Abby's very interesting presentation, I also would like to point 3-4 maximum points to keep the time limit. We have been witnessing for the last, I would say, a little bit before the enactment of the 2014 directive, so 6 years, give and take, a shift of the pendulum, right, in the procurement legislation towards recognizing the need for more flexibility. Some actors have recognized that before, some others, they are joining, the whole process. In my view, what COVID-19 and the response from the public procurement perspective has done so far is to push this pendulum even further towards flexibility, not only in the context of extreme of urgency procurement, but more generally, because some of the challenges, as Abby mentioned very well, did not simply involve a choice of a more flexible procedure. They involved a degree of innovation, new players coming in the supply chain to produce products that they were not producing before in a short time frames. Of course, there are lessons to be learned there. But in my view, the bigger picture is that I think the pendulum has shifted even more. Question, does that mean that after the end of COVID, the pendulum will continue its way towards more flexibility? There is the following question mark. It depends a lot on the lessons that we will learn with regards to those procurements that use flexible frameworks and they were not successful, especially those that where we could identify some abuse of flexibility. I don't know whether that will function as a brake to the pendulum moving forward, but it may provide some context. The other thing that we will need to realize is that there is an inherent risk with more flexibility in procurement, and that is the risk of abuse. So we will have to look to see the lessons learned both at national and at EU level to understand really where are the areas that we need to improve. Sometimes it could be simply a matter of raising the level of professionalization. In some other cases, there may be some other issues with regards to corruption and so on and so forth. Early days. So these are open questions to be answered. And the other thing is that there are many lessons to be learned for joint procurement, not only at the European Union level, but joint procurement more generally in a context of a very short time frame due to urgency. And sometimes this urgency being linked, of course, in the context of the procurement of new vaccines with innovative things that the stakeholders have to come together and cooperate. So as I said, we are at the very early stages, but these are the main areas where I would identify the important lessons that we'll have in the procurement community, but not only in the procurement community, as Abby mentioned, more widely in the social services. There are lessons to be learned from this pandemic. It's a mixed bag so far, so depends how you look at it. But I tend to be a positive and an optimistic person, so I tend to see the glass half full. So we'll end it here, and we're looking forward to the Q&A later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aris. Over to Ben.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm Benjamin Taylor. I run the Public Service Transformation Academy in the UK mostly, and we deliver the Cabinet Office Commissioning Academy under concession contract for UK government and lots of place-based transformational capability building and leadership capability building for transformation in public services in general. I'll be speaking today as a bit of a Cassandra, a harbinger of doom. And coming from a UK-based perspective, really, but there is hope to mix my myths. And a lot of the learning from a learning community to build back better in the days after that we ran for 100 days over the from sort of May onwards through the heart of the kind of first wave of the COVID crisis. The first big point I want to make is that we have flexibility and adaptability, but they need to be targeted to outcomes in complex systems. So the procurement policy notes issued in the UK, the support for social care markets, the management of contract, the adaptation of workflows showed a lot of flexibility, did show that absent governance, that flexibility can lead to some incredibly bad decisions or very good short-term decisions that have long-term consequences. I think it showed that outsourced and state delivery face the same coordination costs and some of the same problematic byproducts. That's a little short thing to say in passing that I could defend more in Q&A if people want to. And we saw this huge pattern of self-organization and mutual aid for the achievement of social outcomes, overwhelmed by larger community and voluntary sector bodies, overwhelmed by umbrella organizations, then local government, then the national state in the UK. So just as people were getting things going at each of those levels, the larger system came crashing in, required things to be legible from the perspective of the larger system, and broke all of that mutuality and all of that relationship building. We're also attracted to the technical, the narrow, the focused, not the actual complex. So we've seen an acceleration of the retreat from outcomes focused commissioning to technical expertise around commercial, around procurement, that's not actually focused on the social outcomes as a whole and the bigger picture. My point is there that we need to urgently learn how to take the flexibility and purpose of this period and apply it to actual outcomes focused, place-based, whole systems working. But my second point is that this is really urgent. One of the things that I think has been a lesson in this period is that there may be the potential to overcome austerity in that mutual aid, self-support, actual focus on community and social outcomes as a whole. But it won't work in this way. So we can't beat austerity, the ongoing kind of, crushing austerity of the UK. And it looks as though, from my sort of local public service delivery focus, that we're looking towards a perfect storm of activity in early 2021. We have local government reform and devolution, potentially a complete rewrite of our procurement laws, the potential abolition of clinical commissioning groups who were doing the commissioning at the local health level, the potential spectre of a no-deal Brexit, further waves of COVID, nationalisation of social care into a national care service, obviously complete turnaround of estate and flexible working across the public sector, trauma, early retirement, all of those kind of things, overwhelming ongoing budget pressures from crushing austerity, a ban on commercial investment by local authorities, which is part of this whole commercial procurement picture, massive backlogs in every service, the removal and centralisation of Public Health England from a local and a national public health body, complete overhaul of the planning system. And I've probably missed 2 or 3 things that are scheduled to happen early in 2021 in the UK. And obviously that's to say nothing of the early stages of climate breakdown. But however, my point remains, we do have capacity and capability to respond quickly, purposefully, and in a hugely effective way. I think any idea that the public sector is not capable of flexibility and not capable under variants, obviously exceptional variants, but variants of our existing procurement legislation should be consigned to the past. But we really need focus and support and capability development to really work on outcomes in actual complex systems.
Thank you very much, Ben. I slightly feel like going away and bursting into tears, but I won't do that.
I gave a warning.
Yeah, you were entirely right to do so. I will hand over instead to Chris. You're next.
Thanks. And Rory, there you go. Perfect. I'm just going to minimize this just a second. So Laurence Folio-Lalliou and I published an article that coincidentally came out this week in the Concurrences, which is a competition journal. Laurence is in Senegal. She'll be joining me on Thursday at 1500 Central European time for a webinar. Information on that webinar is on publicprocurementinternational.com. It's another free webinar that we're hosting through GW Law. There we'll be talking about protectionist issues, and I want to touch on those and also reinforce some of the points that have already been made, including, of course, those made by Abby and by Eris. So some of the things that Laurence and I pointed up in this article is that the COVID-19 pandemic caused a series of disruptions that make us rethink the way that we approach public procurement. The first is what we call the temporal disruption, which is that suddenly we had a situation where contracting officials did not have infinite time to make a procurement. And their failure to respond rapidly and effectively to the pressures of the pandemic really reinforced the fact that oftentimes they fail as agents, as intermediaries in the supply chain process. That leads to the next possible question, which is something we're confronting here in the United States, is whether or not the entire procurement function or parts of it should be outsourced. We are undertaking an experiment that we refer to colloquially as Amazon.gov, where Amazon and other major platforms will be available for federal users to buy from directly up to $10,000. For the reasons I'll talk about in the next few minutes, I think that in fact, the private sector won't displace public procurement, but this certainly was a disruption that raised that question. The second was the competition disruption, that for the first time, governments really were not in a monopolistic situation, but were actually competing with each other. And that created a number of ugly situations. This leads back to the point that Eris was making about joint procurement. In the United States, you actually had the federal government, in some cases, stealing supplies that were being delivered to the state governments under the authority of the Defense Production Act. And that not only was the federal stockpile not reliable for state and local governments, one thing we learned, by the way, was that if a stockpile is not immediately reliable, no one will ever rely on it. And that's what was happening at the state and local level. But the willingness of the federal government to reallocate, sometimes based on political considerations, willing to reallocate supplies. Governor Newsom, for example, in California, had to thank Trump on TV for some supplies that were allocated by our Federal Emergency Management Agency. That was that kind of ugliness that emerged. So there, you suddenly had competition among procuring entities, which raised, to Aris's point, raised real questions about better cooperation in the future. What you call joint procurement, what we call cooperative purchasing. It's also an assumption disruption. One assumption was that that we've had historically was that there would be no competition among procuring entities. That certainly changed. Another disruption was the working assumption that procurement was a standalone function, that it could be independent of other public functions. One of the things that's become very clear, and I think is going to be an important area of development in the coming years, is better cooperation among public authorities, both inside procurement and, for example, in law enforcement, to assess vendors rapidly. There is a provision under Article 9 of the Government Procurement Agreement that calls for cooperation and qualification assessment. I think that's going to be an important emerging issue in the next few years. How can we have cooperation among public authorities to do rapid qualification assessment? The geographic disruption was interesting because historically there's been a very strong native bias or home buy bias. You see it consistently across Europe and the United States, only 2 to 3% cross-border procurement. I'm talking here about the United States government buying abroad. It never exceeds more than 2% in the United States federal spending. That kind of parochialism or isolation was not sustainable during the pandemic. But conversely and ironically, we also saw a surge in protectionism. And so now the United States is engaging or embarking on an effort to onshore medical supplies, onshore medical production under an executive order issued by Trump in the last few weeks. We'll be talking about that during our webinar on Thursday. It poses very serious risks because we will not have the resilient international supply chain that's essential. So some of the lessons that Laurence and I talked about in our article in Concurrences: transparency and integrity, essential. Even when things get really bad, you have to maintain transparency and integrity, at the very least to maintain the legitimacy of the government, which we see badly eroded here in the United States. You also need to work on an international supply chain. I have to tell you in candor, as a public procurement professor, I never worked with supply chain people on the private side. I'm regularly cooperating now with my counterparts who teach private supply chain theory in universities, because it's something we have to know about and we have to learn about as public procurement professors. Buying collectively would solve a lot of the problems of stealing from one another during a pandemic if we have joint procurement or cooperative procurement. And the last is to regulate holistically, to be able to respond rapidly to change. For example, regulating holistically so that we can draw quickly and easily on qualification information from other jurisdictions. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Chris. Next up is Daniela.
Hi, I'm Daniela James. I work at Freshfields. We're a London-based law firm, and we've done a lot of work on outcomes contracts over the last 10 years. One of our aims is to promote the market and grow the market in outcomes-based contracting. So I think with that view, one of the maybe opportunities and things I've been thinking about coming out of the pandemic has been, can they be used to respond to emergencies? And I guess a huge challenge to that has been this perception that outcomes contracts take a long time, that they are complicated contracts. And so that's been something that has been occupying me. And what can we do to be able to use them more quickly? And I think this is important for building the market in general, but in particular for being able to respond to emergencies. I think one of the things I would say is I agree with David's points that he made in the keynote speech about partnerships being hugely important. And I think if we have, and I think other people have touched on that, and Aris's point about flexibility within contracts. And I think if we can improve partnerships and and governance and flexibility, we can make contracts less complex because we don't need to anticipate every eventuality. So I think that's one thing that has been positive coming out of the pandemic, is the focus on partnership and flexibility. And I think there is also this misconception, I would say, that outcomes contracts are necessarily complex. As far as I'm concerned, instead of specifying a service in detail, you specify an outcome in detail. And in reality, it shouldn't be that much more complex. Outcomes type contracting often requires slightly different clauses and provisions to deal with the different relationships that the parties to those contracts have. And it's people's unfamiliarity with those slightly different relationships that is seen to be complex, whereas it's in reality just different. So I think POGO has been fantastic for the sharing of expertise and best practice. And I think building a market and having market norms, as you do in any other sort of financial product or type of contract, to have a market norm will make contracting that much more straightforward and simpler, because everyone will know what they're expecting. And I think my other plug, and perhaps I'm straying into part 2 of this session, is for work products from the POGO group to update and improve the templates that we use in the UK, and perhaps a call for other nations to have templates. I've only seen a few US contracts, outcomes contracts, but it doesn't seem that a standardized contract is used there either. So I think my plug is for more templates, better templates that take into account all different stakeholders' inputs. So talking not only about sort of delivery bodies, investors, obviously the commissioner and the person who holds the outcomes contract are the key parties, but also the service users or participants in the programs. I think having as part of as one of the outcomes of the POGO, outputs of the POGO group, to be better contracts that reflect all of the learning that we've had over this period would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for that, and for comments which, as you say, we can hopefully pick up on later as well. Handing over next to Ian.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today. I just wanted to cover off a couple of the thoughts that we've been having around this area, particularly around the crisis and the procurement response, and perhaps in a sort of slight alternative to Ben's position, which is to say, actually, this is a generational opportunity that, if we make the most of, we can really turn to our advantage. Today, we've published a piece of research with the Open Contracting Partnership that values the global market for public procurement at $13 trillion a year. That's roughly 12% of our global GDP. Now, I think Ben and others here have adequately and eloquently identified the challenges we have in coordinating that spending and what we can do with it. But actually, some of the things that we can do are far more in reach and in touch now than they ever have been, partly due to data and analysis. So we at Spend Network collect millions of records on contract awards and tender notices from all over the world every day. And we use that data to analyze and find opportunities to either improve procurement, but also to suggest where new opportunities lie. And I wanted to just mention a couple that are relevant to this context. One is carbon. When we know where the contracts are, we can actually identify and project the amount of carbon that is associated with the contract, and we can use that to publicly identify where public authorities and or national authorities might reconsider how they procure or which contracts they might let. Currently, it's very easy to point to government and say, you need to do more. But if we know that a contract is going to end in the next 18 months, it's a really good opportunity to identify a new strategy for letting that contract so that it reduces carbon. For instance, in food contracts, we might want to reduce the amount of beef and increase the amount of vegetable that is included in a contract. Equally, on cloud-based hosting, we can look at opportunities to move resources, probably with very little impact on the end user. We can move resources to more efficient locations to reduce the amount of carbon produced. The second one is what I'm sort of terming whole economy purchasing, and that's around identifying the businesses that are most likely to create jobs and the strategies that will support the creation of jobs. We found in the UK that quite often we were making austerity cuts to services like Meals on Wheels, and the net effect of that was that actually we were taking jobs out of the economy that were really valuable. So women who had children who needed flexible working, with the majority of staff who were working at Meals on Wheels services, because they could finish in time to go and look after their children. The problem when you cut all of those jobs was that you put actually a bunch of people who were really making a contribution to the economy back into a position where they weren't making a contribution to the economy, and the net cost was greater than the saving you made. But that's because government wasn't joined up. So we can look at those sort of things and look at those sort of contracts and identify who's being employed and say, yes, actually, we want more of that because it's good for our economies. So a slightly more positive focus to basically say that data might have a chance of making our procurement more focused and deliver positive outcomes across a whole range of metrics for our society.
Wonderful, thank you, Ian. Up next is Malcolm.
Mute, yeah, can you hear me all right? Good. I'm very much on Mark's side on this, is that I take a positive view that this is a real opportunity for moving forward on far more of the sort of partnership procurements that were described in our keynote speaker, who I thought was terrific today. And I think the fact that he had such a broad background across all aspects of procurement is an important feature of this POGO group to talk about later. I mean, I'm not in any way a specialist in social impact bonds or social service commissioning, rather the opposite. As you may have gathered earlier, I was much involved in the development of the 2014 public procurement reforms. And the thing that excites me about the COVID responses is the fact that there has been some element of discovery about the flexibility and the capability to commission work in an innovative way that's been embedded in those regulations since 2014. And if you read the European Commission's documents that they issued as COVID was developing to give guidance to procurement authorities in every European country, it was a truly remarkable document. I mean, for the first time I've seen in any procurement regulatory document, it said to people, if you want to develop a computer system or an application quickly, you can use a procurement contest to do that, and you went into detail about it. And I think one of the principal lessons to learn from this is the fact that we have to accelerate the whole clock speed of procurement, because we're not, with our present procedures, exploiting the ability to move quickly to prototype and then to application quickly, and have contracts that allow that prototyping to proceed in parallel with the delivery of the final outcome. That's the sort of flexibility we want to see. And of course, this is not just true in software, because Abby mentioned the ventilator challenge, which is a really interesting one, where you had a whole consortium of high technology manufacturers getting together and working continuously 24, 48 hours to basically entirely re-engineer a component for digital manufacturing and then install a production line within a month, I think they got it out, and had to meet the regulatory requirements. Now, we need to do that sort of thing from now on. You know, climate change isn't going to wait for us, as the previous speakers have said. So I think we need to be encouraged by the fact and force change to use all the provisions that we've got. Now, what that means, though, and this is the crucial point, is we have to have some recognition and change in high-level political leadership about the abilities of procurement to deliver this. And at the moment, certainly in the UK and I think in other countries, there's a lot of money being put on the table for innovation, innovative small businesses to come up with solutions to specific problems in health or in social isolation as a response to the COVID position. But very few of them are actually deploying innovative procurement, and they certainly ought to be, because actually innovative procurement is a far more efficient way and a way of strengthening the whole of the marketplace for small businesses than we've seen before. So that's my real lesson from what we've seen so far. And I hope it's something that we can put firmly on the agenda of this excellent grouping, which I've been privileged to be a part, perhaps coming in from outside, for the next cycle of our work together.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Malcolm. Next up is Mark.
Hi, hello everybody. My name is Mark Rodden. I'm Head of Procurement for 2 local authorities in the UK, North Somerset Council and South Gloss Council. Apologies, I'm not using video today. My signal's a bit weak, so if I use video, you won't be able to hear me. So what am I learning as a result of the pandemic? Well, I suppose the first thing I want to talk about is probably something that I knew all along, which is that contracts are much less relevant in times of crisis. Relationships are the important thing. I think COVID's made it difficult for many government suppliers to provide the services that they're contracted to provide, but the vast majority of these suppliers are still very, very keen to try and provide the service in some way. So rather than spend time reading contracts and arguing about what sort of force majeure clause you've got, time's much better spent collaboratively working with suppliers, working out pragmatically how best to meet the outcomes within the service, which means in terms of procurement skills, relationship management skills become at the moment, I think, far more important than negotiation and enforcement, although possibly that was always the case. I mean, Aris talked very well earlier about flexibility. I think this also reinforces that flexibility of service provision is key at the moment. Contracts that specify the method of delivery are in many cases having to be rewritten in my world at the moment. Contracts that are based on outcomes are okay and don't need to be rewritten because the required outcomes haven't changed, which underlines how important it is to focus those contracts on those outcomes in the first place. And in rewriting those contracts, I mean, Ian and Malcolm have talked about this sort of generational opportunity. I do think there is a real opportunity now to say, yes, we understand why that's important now, and we're going to lay the foundations for the future for contracts that are based more on outcomes. Second point I wanted to make was around the government's financial response to the crisis, which I found very interesting. Amongst a wide range of measures to support businesses, the supply relief instructions and guidance that the government's issued has almost, I think, nationally flown under the radar. If the government's issued 2 policy notes, one to cover up to the end of June and the second one to take us to the end of October, was that government bodies should just carry on paying their suppliers, really, regardless of whether they are actually able to provide the service. I mean, don't get me wrong, there were lots of caveats and direction about payment on an open book basis, but the basic message was, forget what the supplier is contractually obliged to do. We want to support these suppliers so that they're still here at the end of all of this to provide the service. So it's interesting that from one of the things that's been clear there from a government procurement perspective, we still have a role, certainly in local authorities and across the whole of government, I'm sure, to support the economy, not just to provide those services. Looking forward, I think one of the biggest challenges now for government procurement is working out the right time to sort of get back to going back to the market again, certainly with competitive tendering. There's a strong message coming back from many sectors now about how busy they are just staying afloat. Please don't make me use that valuable resource writing tenders. I've got enough to do already. And I think as buyers in the public sector, we're sympathetic to this, but obviously we can't go on extending contracts and deferring competition indefinitely. I mean, Chris talked very well about competition disruption there. It was interesting around, I think he mentioned government organisations who are effectively competing for the same resource. But I think this competition disruption sort of works both ways, really, because if you take a purely commercial view, there are some opportunities emerging in the market at the moment to exploit spare capacity. If you look at the care home market, for instance, at the moment, many areas of the UK, the care home market is very different across the whole of the UK, but many care homes have been exploiting their position in the seller's market for many years. At the moment, less people are being placed in care homes, which is leading to vacancies, therefore there's more market capacity, and there are opportunities to negotiate lower rates. If you go about doing that, then that might have an adverse long-term effect on the market, and it will seriously weaken some of those relationships that we've got at the moment. So we need to think very carefully about how much the government should be and could be exploiting its position in weak markets at the moment. The key skills here, I think, are around understanding the markets we're working in and balancing that relentless drive that we get in public procurement to reduce costs and to save money and to negotiate better rates with suppliers, balancing all that with the long-term impact on relationships with some very, very vulnerable suppliers at the moment and the impact that might have on future capacity. Procurement also needs to understand when the right time is to go to market, balancing that opportunity with the understanding the cost of tendering for busy suppliers. And the final point I just wanted to make, I think Daniela's probably made it much better than I would already when she talked about contracting for outcomes, having simpler contracts, and the misconception that I completely agree with around contracting for outcomes is harder than standard contracts. I think a lot of contracts, as I mentioned earlier, are being renegotiated at the moment to change the way in which they are being delivered. And regardless of whether we actually pay suppliers on the basis of achieving outcomes, I think if there's one thing we should learn from all of this, to allow the supplier that flexibility in the way they deliver the services, trusting the supplier to know more about delivering the service than you do, has to be a good thing and has to be something that we need to learn for the future. That was all I was going to say. I was going to talk a little bit about PPE, but I think Abby's done that very well, so I won't cover that point. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mark. And we move on now to Oscar.
Thank you, and hi everyone. Thanks to Ruari for inviting me to the panel, and thanks to the other panelists for the really interesting interventions. I'm Oscar Hernandez. I'm a senior program manager with the Open Contracting Partnership, or OCP. And at OCP, what we do is that we work with governments and their stakeholders to implement data-driven reform projects that improve the effectiveness and fairness of government contracting. And our work has shown that open contracting can significantly improve services for citizens while helping curb corruption and generate savings. And what I mean by open contracting is when there is timely, high quality open data, and when businesses and civil society have a voice and the government has an ear to listen to that voice. So really the main point of my intervention today is that the partners that have made more progress in terms of open contracting have also been the ones that have been more able to navigate this crisis. So what have we seen during these past few months? I think that more than ever before, the COVID-19 outbreak has shown us the relevance of having effective and open procurement systems, as many of you have mentioned today. And even today, months into the pandemic, we see government agencies around the world still scrambling to buy life-saving medical supplies. I think many people used to think about public procurement as this boring compliance exercise, but now I think everyone can see, and we can see how important it is for governments to be able to buy fast and to buy smart. And one good example of that is that everyone, I think, now understands how important it is and was for governments to quickly be able to buy ventilators. And we have also learned that governments need to know exactly how many ventilators they need, where can they get them from, and that they will have actually the right specifications and quality for a fair price of those ventilators. But most governments we have seen responding to the crisis have faced coordination problems, have faced unreliable vendors, and also multiple corruption scandals. And in the US, for example, and elsewhere, millions of dollars in contracts have been awarded for life-saving protective equipment that never really materialized. And sometimes when it did, they turned out to be counterfeit. So I think part of the problem is that even under normal circumstances, public procurement is the #1 corruption risk for governments. And as governments start to relax their procurement regulations, bad actors are really taking advantage of those new rules to enrich themselves at the expense of the public. And one example that shows how bad this can get is in Paraguay, the head of the public oil company is currently being prosecuted for mistakenly buying hundreds of thousands of dollars in tonic water as alleged protection against coronavirus. So basically, to address this crisis, OCP has supported procurement practitioners, from both government and civil society to leverage procurement to deliver better results. And we have drawn 5 lessons from the experience of our partners that are navigating the crisis that I want to share here today quickly. So the first lesson is really having the right policies in place. So we know that COVID is requiring governments to move more quickly than legal frameworks typically allow, but there should be clear guidance on when and how to use those emergency procedures. And there should also be key safeguards, such as rapid disclosure requirements, so that you're able to buy fast, but also that people know what you're buying. The second lesson is about coordination. So I think the worst examples as many have mentioned today, are situations where you see hospitals, agencies, local and national governments bidding against each other for a limited supply. And one thing that can help with that is obviously coordinating and centralizing demand. But coordination also means having better communication strategies. So we have good examples from Canada that I'm not gonna explain here because I'll leave for the Q&A, but just like having better communications with the vendor community. The third lesson is that we need to collect and publish high quality open data. So open data really helps with coordination to conduct faster market research and due diligence and supply chain management. So one key takeaway regarding the data is that it is critical to be able to track all COVID spending. And it is also a key to disclose all the details associated with the award with awards done during emergency procedures, just so people have good accountability of that spending. And lesson number 4 is the need for key supplier insight. So obviously buyers need to understand who are their suppliers, they need to conduct due diligence, and they need to understand their track record. So there's a really interesting conversation going on about this in the chat. And I think many tools and methodologies that are driven by open data can help to this purpose. And that includes both red flags and business intelligence tools. So just to give you one example, Ukraine's ProZero allows using risk analytics to identify the links between buyers and suppliers, while also allowing to trace abnormally high transaction volumes between the two. And I think the final lesson, and perhaps the most important one for me at least, is that civil society contract monitoring is key to safeguard public resources. So civil society can create powerful feedback loops to curb corruption and generate procurement reforms, as proven by multiple rigorous studies. And in a recent example, Ecuador, which is a project that I'm working on, created, they didn't have any open data, and they created this public search tool to monitor COVID-19 emergency procurement. And that tool helped civil society to identify overpriced contracts for key medical supplies, which in turn generated public pressure to suspend processes and hold actors accountable. And this is all leading to procurement reforms that should improve procurement outcomes in the medium and long run. So this all may sound like a lot, but I think the good news is that each reformer doesn't need to reinvent the wheel. There's places like this, but there are also global resources that we're ready to share with you at the Open Contracting Partnership. So if anyone on this call is wondering how they can get started, please get in touch. I'll leave my email in the chat box. Thanks, Anne.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Next up is Sope.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. So my name is Shokwe Williams Elegbe. I'm a law professor at Stellenbosch University. I teach and research in the area of public procurement and anti-corruption, focusing on mostly African countries and the multilateral development banks. I'm also the deputy director of the African Procurement Law Unit, which is based at Stellenbosch University, which is in South Africa, and the co-director of our online LLM program in public procurement regulation and policy. So I'll be talking really about the lessons we've learned in African countries with my experience in Nigeria and South Africa, and then talking about what has really been happening and the lessons that we can draw from there. So I'll maybe first say on a not so positive note that the effects of the pandemic have been brutal in a lot of African countries. Now, although we've been spared the heavy death toll from the virus itself, and recovery rates from infections are better than in many other regions, African procurement systems in particular have been stressed to their limits. And this is for a number of reasons. So for the last maybe 15 years, I'll say, a lot of African countries had moved to procurement, or had moved to procurement models that were very decentralized. And the idea behind that was to increase the effectiveness of procurement and bring procurement closer to the end users. But we found in the pandemic that this hasn't really served us well. And because of that, there are very few countries that could quickly aggregate procurement requirements in response to the pandemic, especially for health goods. And as was highlighted by Chris Eukins in his presentation, this meant that a lot of our procuring authorities were then competing against each other for limited supplies. And this led to increased fraud by opportunistic contractors and a lot of failed procurements, a lot of failed outcomes. I think Oscar also mentioned the fact that, some deliveries not being made or for substandard or counterfeit goods. So we saw a lot of that. And I think that has provided us with the understanding that it's necessary for us to have procurement modalities that allow for centralization and aggregation. One thing that it did do, that it puts the SADC initiative on pooled procurement of medical supplies in the spotlight. The SADC is the Southern African Development Community, and it's a regional economic community in Southern Africa of 16 countries. So a few years ago, the SADC actually set up a joint procurement framework for medical supplies because of problems like HIV and TB in the region. And so they actually looked a lot to that initiative when the pandemic hit. And so we're hoping that the pooled procurements for medical supplies will be given a lot more focus and attention in the future. The other challenge that we've had in some African countries that has provided a lot of learning is really something that we have struggled with for forever, which is the fact that there's an over-reliance on foreign imports for health goods and for manufactured goods generally. I think that more than other regions, many African countries have relied or have traditionally relied on cheaper foreign supplies, especially those coming from Asia. And so the disruption of those supply chains affected our ability to immediately respond to the pandemic, especially in relation to the procurement of PPEs and ventilators. But what that did was that it actually forced us to look inwards. And in both Nigeria and South Africa, government and non-government entities began to manufacture invasive and non-invasive ventilators and PPEs. And these are items that ordinarily we would automatically procure from Asia or Western Europe. So I think that has been a good learning that we actually do have those capabilities. And when we were forced to, we turned inwards. So what we've learned is that first, the having modalities for the aggregation of procurement requirements is important and necessary and needs to be pursued within our procurement systems, whether we're talking about framework contracts or other modalities. Secondly, the over-reliance on foreign imports, especially in relation to social services, health and education as well, is unsustainable and even a bit dangerous. And the pandemic forced our governments to look inwards, and we were able to rise to the occasion. The last point I will make is that in relation to, we found that our procurement systems are not flexible, not resilient or adaptable at all. And there's so many loopholes that were, that led to a lot of fraud and corruption. So in Nigeria, there was a large-scale diversion of procurement and resources, non-delivery, diversion of public sector goods to the private sector for resale. And in South Africa as well. In fact, in South Africa, the public sector has a new term, which is COVIDpreneur. So those who profit from COVID-related contracts. So a huge lesson that we've had to learn is how to make our procurement systems less vulnerable to fraud and corruption, of course, and how to ensure that even emergency procurements can still have the right outcomes. So I'll say that the three lessons that we've had to learn very quickly is centralization or aggregation is important, local supplies, and addressing fraud and corruption across the board, but especially in relation to emergency procurements. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And our final contribution is from Tanya and Vidi.
Hi, am I audible?
You are audible.
Thank you, Anne. Yep. And thank you very much for those very insightful points on the subject matter. Vidhi and I are both lawyers. We specialize in white-collar crime, anti-bribery, anti-corruption laws, and procurement frauds in India. So we're going to be following a structure which basically talks about what was the course of action taken by Indian agencies in the procurement-related function when the pandemic hit it. And we're going to be talking about the learnings, what worked, what did not work, and what are the areas of improvement. Now, to quickly give you an understanding of how procurement works in India, India has, since 2016, been following a digitized mode of public procurement. So there's a portal which works a lot like how Amazon works. I'm sure everyone over here knows how Amazon works. It is called the Government e-Marketplace, and it's basically like an Amazon for all the procurement related activities that are happening. So there's e-tenders, there's electronic, there's a digitized process which is followed and which ensures transparency, reduction of procurement frauds, etc. Now, when the COVID situation hit India, India was faced with an immediate need to strengthen the public health systems. Now, what it did was it followed a two-pronged approach. It was a centralized procurement system which it followed, and a decentralized procurement system. Now, with the centralized procurement system, what happened was, for all the commodities that were not available and were not being manufactured in India, the central government assessed the demand that was required, and it entered into tendering process with international entities to get the best possible commercial negotiations and get the products at the earliest and in the most commercially viable situation. The second is the decentralized mode, which was followed by the states. Now, as a lot of you would know, India is a huge country. So in case there was a state-specific requirement for a particular medication, for a particular set of ventilators or something, some other health equipment, then these state-specific requirements could be covered by some vendor which was working within India, but somewhere very far away from that particular state. So these two modes and working in tandem ensured that the best possible healthcare equipments could be procured to deal with the kind of pandemic that we were dealing with. Now, I'll give you one quick case study on how India ensured that it started increasing its PPE manufacturing. Now, India was not traditionally producing PPEs in a quantity that could be used for the pandemic situation. When the situation hit us, what we did was that the government prepared a public-private partnership. It congregated all the textile manufacturers and all the small-scale manufacturers who were willing to work towards building PPE kits in bulk, and to ensure that the demands could be met for this health emergency that we had. Now, within 2 months of the COVID outbreak, we started manufacturing PPE kits, and today we are able to build PPE kits which are more than 4.5 lakhs per day, and we are now the second largest manufacturers of PPE kits globally. Now, what's important to understand here is also the fact that in a pandemic-like situation, the procurement rules cannot work in silo. So there has to be a lot of economic considerations that have to be there, geopolitical conditions that have to be looked at, geostrategic conditions which have to be looked at, and the procurement rules must be must be incorporated and must be enforced in an environment which is conducive to all these other supporting mechanisms which will help it achieve the objective that it's supposed to achieve. Now, I'll quickly hand over the stage to Vidhi, who's going to talk about the what are the learnings from the entire pandemic situation here.
Thanks, Tanya, and thank you, everybody. The discussion was really, really insightful. And like Tanya said, that we both are white-collar investigations lawyer, and I would like to bring in a little perspective of, fraud, integrity, and transparency that's kind of ingrained in the government procurement contracts. Now, talking about the lessons that, we say that India has learned from procurement during COVID-19 is that everybody is looking at it from the lens of how swift can the procurement in India could be. So this is mostly coming from a transformation that was much needed in terms of the opportunity cost that we had for complex procurement procedure and very cumbersome procurement procedures. But I also look from a very practical experience. We also look at it from a very different perspective. So for this, I would step back a little and go to how ordinarily the procurement contracts worked in India. So ordinarily, if we see the gamut of fraud, corruption, transparency, integrity in government procurement was pretty well defined. Now, most of the companies, private partnerships, in fact, government had proper controls, risk mitigation strategies to realize that to know that what are the touch points, what are the checks and balances that are required to ensure that there is no corruption and fraud in the government procurement practices. Now, let's take an example of integrity pacts that we had, the introduction of digitized e-procurement system, like Tanya said. So all of those were a pretty cumbersome procedures, but they were pretty well defined to ensure there are checks and balances for fraud and corruption. Now, of course, we are not living in the ordinary times, and we are living in times of COVID. Now, here things are pretty fast, and everything is moving in to meet the mismatch between the demand and supply. Now, given that there are significant amount of money that is being spent by the government to meet the COVID-19 domestic demand, the main checks and balances of the fraud or corruption are the ones that fails. So from a very practical experience, we see that the provisions that have kicked in during the emergency procurement is, direct requirement without quotations from different vendors or from suppliers. So what are the problems that we see right now is that there are no competition to ensure that the bids are right. And we're selecting the right vendor or a supplier to give us the products. So ultimately, the question that India is right now facing is that are we selecting the right customers? Are we selecting the right suppliers? And ultimately, when we look at the overall procedure, are we having the right procedure to ensure that the procurement is going in the right direction? Now, to be very honest with you, India as a developing country only started the e-procurement in 2016. Now, what we really need to understand is that India or mostly all developing countries need to have an e-procurement system that starts with the digitization and ends with it. Whereas in countries like India, that it's quite in the middle. So it starts with all the digitization, but at some point of time, it becomes a very physical activity. Like, for example, if I'm accepting a bid, I would actually send a fax to a private company or any private partnership to say, yes, I've accepted your bid. And that's where the audit trail goes bust. Now, what we need to ensure is to understand that the emergency procurement or any other kind of procurement data should be centralized on the e-procurement portals, which of course our government is working on, and they're trying to ensure that everything is in order to for the suppliers to be able to access there. Now, the other part is that there has to be open data to strengthen the due diligence of suppliers. Now, like Tanya mentioned, there's a portal called DMET in India, where suppliers and the list of suppliers are there with the type of products they're supplying. So that's how it makes it easier for them to even for the country to look at what suppliers are there and who is supplying what, for the more transparency. Now the government is also trying to publicize the sanctions for fraud and corruption to ensure that this is not happening at a right scale, and everybody who's entering into any such practices are able to understand that what are the sanctions they will applicable to them. Apart from this, I think one of the greatest learning that we have is that we should understand that emergency procurement is not something which is universal. It has to be in tandem with the normal and traditional procurement practices as well. So at one place we are doing emergency procurement, but it has to go hand in hand with the other traditional procurement practices to ensure that there is no overdose of anything. So I think with great digitization in India, what we'll be able to establish is a great audit trail, and that's how it could solve most of the problems for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to all of our speakers for sticking beautifully to time under very challenging conditions. You've all done extremely well. I think Rory's going to perhaps do a bit of summing up and introduce the Q&A for us. Rory, are you there?
Yeah, so thanks very much, everyone. I was scanning the very active chat for some questions. I thought I would just put some questions out there and allow people to select what questions they might want to answer, and I'll just stick them together. There were some questions around, I'm describing these questions as being around information, information to aggregate, and information to judge reputation or performance. And I'm wondering if people are seeing some best practices of that, of people using information well, whether it's for aggregation or for judging performance or reputation. There was another set of questions around the comments around innovation. And it was striking to me that both people in the UK and people from South Africa and Malcolm in the UK were describing innovation practices. I was wondering if those are likely to continue. And if we do want more innovative procurement, how can we encourage that? And then there was also that sort of third area around sort of reputation versus rules and perception of what rules are, relationships versus rules and perception of rules. I was wondering if anybody had, again, some examples of something that's been navigated well, whether it's the flexibility or leaning on the relationships. I'm going to offer that to the group. If anybody wants to sort of nominate themselves for answering that or addressing some of that, that would be helpful. Well, if people don't want to, don't hesitate to jump in, but my reflection, or something I put in the chat, was about this question of reputation, which came up in the earlier session. And I really appreciated some of Chris's comments and Abby's comments around it, and Stefan's comments around the challenges of the practical challenges and legal challenges around using performance information and even collecting performance information.
So Rory, if I could pipe in, I think a point of interest is how the open contracting principles and how the open contracting data standards could be used for qualification information to assess the reputational performance risk posed by prospective contractors. Most of us are familiar with the open contracting data standards for purposes of contract administration, but I haven't seen any real discussion of how those standards could be used for reputational information, qualification information regarding contractors. Because I think if we could have a more standardized and transparent access to qualification information in other jurisdictions, that would reduce a lot of risk for procuring entities.
Yeah, so I want to chime in here. I think that's a really interesting point and something that we have started to think about. I think to think about what would be. I think the key challenge here is obviously sharing openly that information in a way that is productive to everyone through standards and that people can use. But also, how do you still and thinking, this being a working group centered around common outcomes. How do you create a collaborative relationship with vendors having that information? And I think, and this is my personal opinion, because I think I need to refine my thinking around this as well. It's just, like there are multiple systems. For example, the city of Seattle has a 360 performance review system where, it's not only governance rating the vendors, but also vendors rating the governance, right? And to the extent that you could have that kind of information that really helps create more collaborative relationships in an open format, I think moving towards that direction, it's indeed important. And obviously, I think the standard is flexible enough to collect that information in a meaningful way. I think a lot of the information that's being currently collected relates to implementation data, like whether payments are being done on time, whether milestones are being hit on time, but actually having, performance information mostly lives in internal procurement systems and even contract management systems, which aren't necessarily the same. So I think moving towards that direction is something that I'm personally very interested in, and that I'm sure that would benefit the global community a lot.
I might come in there as well.
I could follow up with you, Oscar. So
Sorry, was that someone else speaking?
I can hear Abby. So Abby, do you want to just go ahead and we'll see who else that was in a minute?
Okay, thank you, Anne. I just wanted to say that I think it's an area we've really struggled with in Europe and the UK as well, because when you introduce obviously the legal framework and rules around, that are trying to ensure a certain degree of both objectivity and accountability in procurement, you also tend to lose that ability to sort of informally evaluate reliability, reputation, to act on what one person might call a good insider tip would be another person's hearsay or sort of discriminatory comments. So I think it's a very difficult area to get right, because ultimately, you don't want procurers to be acting on sort of, well, somebody told me this was not a reliable company. You do want them to have to back up their decisions and to have reference to objective sources. And in the European context, there's this idea of self-cleaning, so that just because a company did something bad 5 years ago doesn't necessarily mean they should forever be banned from public contracts. So it's a very complicated area, and it's interesting to hear about these more informal systems with sort of ratings, which could be interesting. But I suspect in the European context you would end up having sort of legal challenges to the ratings, because obviously it's an area that suppliers are very concerned about if they have a negative rating on a system like that.
Abby, the other person who was wanting to come in was Chris. Chris, you there?
I am, and thanks very much, Abby. I have a question related to your comment and a question to Oscar. So in the U.S., the past performance in the federal system, the past performance information is only available to the vendor and to the government customer. It's not publicly available. And then past performance is actually separately assessed. It's with a numerical assessment in many procurements. It's done separately from the technical evaluation. The question I have for you, Oscar, is if the qualification information is available only to other governments and is not available to the public, at least as a first stage. We believe in the United States that past performance information will eventually become public. There will be some and the past performance information will become public. But the first step is past performance information is not public. Would you be okay, Oscar, if qualification information were readily available to other governments, but not available to the public? Would that be an okay first step?
So that's a really good question. So I would say, I mean, to the extent that the ultimate purpose of this is having open data around vendor performance, because I think, so Professor, I think like I think there's like a couple of like different dimensions here. So as Abhi was mentioning, I think, you know, the big thing to get right is that that information is accurate and people stop acting on just like hearsay or like just like not making decisions that are based out of data. And to that end, I think like what you're proposing really helps towards that direction. But I also think there's a dimension of feedback loops here, of like, you know, like having citizens be able to use this data to collect the data, and that's basically the open contracting data standard. As you know, it's only a tool towards that, right? It's only a tool to get citizens involved, to get civil society involved, and to create those feedback loops. Of course, like to the extent that like right now governments don't even have any access to vendor performance data, moving towards that direction would be really interesting. But I think like in addition to that question, it's like we really know that having open data even helps governments use their data more, because normally when the information is available only to governments, there are multiple silos that are created for the information, even if it's, you know, like supposed to be available for procurement officers or just like buying agencies. So I think like that would be, so I guess to answer your question directly, I think I would be okay with that as long as it's an intermediate step towards a greater goal of actually having data on vendor performance, but data that actually creates collaborative relationships with the marketplace.
Thanks, Oscar. I've got a couple of other questions coming in. So Ian is first and then Aris.
I just wanted to come back on that point regarding making data available only to governments. As a business that consumes and publishes large amounts of procurement data, you know, obviously you have to take what I'm going to say with a pinch of salt, because we would be cut out of that proposal. But I think that my feeling is that it's pretty impractical. How would you identify that, you know, a person with an email was actually from the Treasury in South Africa or from Malaysia and therefore had rights to access your data on a certain supplier, or you had rights to access data on another supplier? The other thing that we know is that when suppliers are told in advance that people are going to openly publish data on their performance, they tends to focus their mind a great deal. And as long as that they are aware of that at the outset of a contract, I think it's a really good thing. I mean, we're in a very difficult position now where poor performance has cost lives, and we want to right wrongs. But I think if we can openly go forward saying, right, from now on, we are going to expect this, and demand it of our suppliers and be public about how that data was arrived at, I think we will actually be brave. If we can be that brave, we can make big impacts.
Thanks, Ian. Aris, you're up next.
Thank you. I think that technologies, particularly the AI, you know, development, may provide some solutions. Of course, this solution will have to be tailored or mirrored by or qualify, meet the standards, the legislative standards, general procurement, the regulation on data protection. I'm talking about the EU, but it can be done. I think there is plenty of information out there already that could be bundled together. It's a technical issue. And this information is publicly available, which means that we wouldn't necessarily even need to worry too much with the data protection standards. So that means that technical solution could be developed. A point that I would like to raise, which is beyond the issue of reputation, which of course is really important. And we saw that in the context of Corellion here. Corellion had a great reputation, right? But one of the issues that we were not aware at the beginning is that Corellion, because of its good reputation, won many contracts at the same time and was not able to deliver on those contracts. So an additional, I think, information apart from the reputation itself, it's if and when it is possible, and it seems to me that technically it could be possible to have that access almost in real time of the ongoing commitments that companies have to deliver. So you may have a reputable company that participates in a context, but then you realize that they are overcommitted, right? They have good reputation, but they are overcommitted. In the context of emergency procurement, like the COVID one, to bring in the earlier part of the discussion, that could be absolutely devastating. If they're in, as opposed to some newcomers with zero or very limited reputation that actually has the capacity to deliver. We don't know that in advance, but it's something that, you know, ex post we can always identify. So this is another element that I think we should be bearing in mind. New technologies perhaps would be able to address that.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm sure that we could continue this discussion for some time, but time is against us. So I'm going to hand over now to Rory, who's going to introduce part 2 of the discussion, which is looking at how we can co-design our work for the next 12 months. Rory.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to be concise because I have, I think, 10 minutes left. Is that true? So, Ruby, could you share the slides? Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody who completed the questionnaire that I sent around last month. So about 16 of you responded. We typically have about 30 people on the call, so this is not a bad response rate considering it was not the easiest questionnaire to complete and took a bit of time. Everybody said that we were satisfactory or very satisfactory, and I just wanted to share some insights to help us inform what we want to do over the next 12 months. I then proposed to put us into breakout rooms briefly to get some more information from this group, because I feel like this group is more a wider group than we normally have, and so I want to be cognizant of that and take advantage of that. So the people who completed the survey, at least about a quarter were government, quarter were private sector, and more than a quarter were third sector. If we go to the next slide, many of you, can we go to the next slide? Sorry, Ruby. Thanks very much. Most of you are practitioners, and a third of us are research or academia. We had a mix of lawyers, health policy, health and social services, and public policy people filling out this survey. If you go to the next slide, I think it was interesting that most have at least 10 years of experience in this group. I think that's sort of important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So I asked people, what should the composition be over the next 12 months, to help us sort of target our audience and recruitment efforts. And apparently academics are the least desired people over the next 12 months. But what we do want is more people from service delivery organizations. And that was closely tied with people from government organizations and from civil society. So I think that was a helpful insight. And I think it sort of will make this group even more valuable to all of us. You go to the next slide, please. I was asking people about the operations, and people said they would be interested in joining a working group. We go to the next slide. This is kind of hard to read, but basically, it's good to be over on the left here. We was talking about outputs, and people really wanted stories, documents, and other data from relevant projects, which I interpret to mean about case studies. So I asked about lots of different, things, including templates or tools or, a course. And the things that really stood out was, resources from actual projects. If we go to the next slide, please. so we have different focus areas, and it was clear that the thing was sort of did the best, or sort of the most people were most interested in, was helping public sector leaders understand how public procurement may be used to improve social outcomes through collaboration. So not focusing on the capacity building for procurement professionals themselves, but rather focusing on helping public sector leaders understand strategic procurement. So that's sort of a focus for us potentially over the next 12 months. Go to the next slide. Here we sort of have got some breakout room activities for you, because I'm conscious that we've got an opportunity here to get feedback from others, including sort of understanding more about types of organizations represented in your group, but trying to unpack these things that we've sort of identified as potentially being helpful over the next 12 months, about, you know, some information about the blockers or opportunities related to the public sector leaders in organizations, and thirdly, asking you if there are stories or documents or other data in your, in your organization that you might want to share with this group. So I think I have here a link for people to a form. All right, I'm trying to send the link to everyone in the chat. This should take you to a form. If somebody could check that that doesn't like blow up when you hit it, that would be helpful. I'm asking these 3 questions, and I think Ruby is going to hit some buttons, and it'll magically take us into a small number of breakout groups where we can fill out this form either individually or as a group, and then we'll return here in I guess in 5 minutes for closing by Anne. Oh, Lee's doing it. Wonderful. So shout if you have problems getting to that form. I think Lee is taking us to breakout rooms now. You should have on your screen the option to move to your breakout room. Please do so. Thank you.
So we're back. Ben and I are back.
Welcome back, everyone. Thanks, Malcolm.
Yeah.
So I hope that wasn't too disorientating.
No.
I think that I am done. Thanks very much for your input in advance. I look forward to co-designing the next 12 months with you all, and very grateful for your participation, and to Anne for leading all these sessions so far. Anne, over to you.
Yeah, so just a big thank you from me to everyone who's contributed today, and apologies to those of you who had questions or comments that we didn't manage to accommodate. Thank you to everybody for being so beautifully behaved. And I think the big challenge for us over the next 12 months is to get the word out there. I think there's quite, I mean, obviously we have our disagreements, but I think there's quite a lot of consensus around the group on that this can be done, that we can do it well, that we know what to do. But it's just getting the word out there to people who are maybe not quite so into this as some of us are, and haven't picked up those lessons yet, or don't have the confidence or the experience or the know-how to do it. So I think it's all about getting out there and spreading the word about what fantastic things can be done. So this is the challenge. And I hope lots of us will accept it and pick it up over the coming year. And I look forward to helping in that process. Can I also just say, before we go, massive thanks to Rory and everyone else in the GoLab team. They do all the hard work behind the scenes. I front this up, but they just tell me what to do. They are amazing, hardworking people, and do all sorts of great things getting us organized. So big well done to them. Thank you very much.